Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to the EduSat network. Our topic of discussion is environmental history, and this will be a continuation from our lecture yesterday where the subject expert was providing an introduction to the same, and we shall continue from there. So friends, for this discussion I would like to introduce our subject expert. Please welcome Dr. Meyankom Kumar. Thank you for coming, sir. Dr. Meyankom Kumar is Associate Professor, Satьяваті College, Evening, University of Delhi. So, without much ado, I would request sir to begin the lecture. Thank you for coming, sir.
And good afternoon to everybody. Let me begin from what we were discussing yesterday. Yesterday I was trying to argue that we must distinguish between history of environment and environmental history. And in that sense, and in this context, I was trying to suggest that it is the centrality of humans which makes environmental history. History of environment includes several other things, but when we discuss environmental history, we specifically say when we are dealing with the humans. This becomes all the more important simply because when we place humans at the center, then we try to examine the role, influences, impact of environmental factors on human activity, on human society, and how humans have been adapting to, changing according to the changes in the environment. So, this process, this continuous negotiation between humans and environment is basically core of environmental history. This examination is also important to understand if there are changes in the environment which are imminent, then how are we going to negotiate with that? How are we going to adapt to those changes? In that sense, it is also important for us to learn lessons from the past. As an environmental historian, we have been focusing on areas beginning from say beginning of agriculture till the modern times. But as we were discussing yesterday, the focus has been unfortunately on modern India or modern period, post-industrial phase. What are the reasons I was trying to discuss yesterday when I cited Richard Grove's article, in what ways the greater integration of globe with the geographical discoveries and with the coming of Europeans in various parts, the discovery of New World, all those created a kind of knowledge network which enabled humans to document nature. And against that documentation, nature has been examined, environment has been examined. One more thing before we proceed further, we must understand that when we discuss environmental history, though at times it has been classified in terms of ancient, medieval, modern, but this does not hold true for environmental history. Environment cuts across this artificial division of history into ancient, medieval or modern. There are environmental factors which are coming from ancient times, which continues till modern time. There are variations which are, but all these variations cannot be examined, segregated in terms of ancient, medieval or modern. I have discussed this in the slide, so we will come to know about that as well. But at the moment, what I was trying to suggest is that this artificial division of ancient, medieval, modern has been negated by environmental historians. In this connection, I was also discussing that environmentalism has also played very important role. Concern for environment, movement for environment, all these have been shaping the future, the contours of environmental history. But before I venture into that trend of environmental history, let me remind that there has been a continuous interaction in terms of examining the role of geography while explaining historical processes. And in that context, French school of historiography, Annales school, has been playing very important role. The beginning of Annales school can be traced in the beginning of 20th century, around 1910s and 1920s, and it continues till today. Annales school was very important in the sense that they shifted focus of historian from political factors, from economic factors, from social factor to the role of geography. They greatly emphasized role of geography. In what ways geographical factor has been influencing human society, human understanding of environment and their adaptation to the geographical conditions. They have been also examining the role played by climate. Before the whole notion of whole problem of global warming came into picture, even before that, historians of analysis school had started examining history of climate. They were trying to examine in what ways climate has been fluctuating or changing and how societies have been meeting those changes, how they have been mitigating those changes, or how they have modified their livelihood pattern in response to climate changes. These examinations were also correlated with the history of the crops pattern during these times of climatic fluctuations, which means agriculture was also being examined. Agriculture not as a revenue resource, that was consideration of economic historians. Agriculture as a crop pattern, how it is growing, how it is being influenced by climatic factors, how it is being influenced by geographical factors, and in what ways humans have been modifying it, changing it, using various kind of methods to enhance the productivity, which means agriculture was also being taken care in terms of its environmental understanding. To examine environment, to examine the crop pattern, the historians were also forced to examine the variety of soils, the type of soils, what kind of production were they sustaining, how these kind of soils can be useful for different kind of cropping patterns. In what ways can we modify or introduce new kind of crops in the particular kind of soils, which means environmental historians to examine the society were examining the agrarian production processes in terms of its environmental conditionings, which means the environment's domain was being expanded and historians were taking cognizance of that, especially particularly analysis school. Another very important, very significant contribution of analysis school, though they do not claim them to be environmental historian, but an important contribution of environmental historian analysis schools has been that they were examining pre-industrial age. As we were discussing yesterday, it is the documentation which is visible. It is the documentation of nature, environmental factors, geography, production processes, flora, fauna, which was extensively documented 15th, 16th, 17th centuries onward. Analysis school was examining the role of environment, crop patterns, geography, climate even prior to this kind of documentation, which means they were relying on, they were using extensively variety of sources, thus expanding the domain of knowledge for the historians. The sources which were considered as religious, the sources which were considered as cultural, the sources which were considered as geographical, they were using all those sources to reconstruct the environment, to understand in what ways these can be used to understand the climate, to understand the crop pattern, and then the society which was managing all these changes or all these environmental conditions. It is also very important simply because the kind of documentation which was available with them was very meager in sense of construction of environment. As I discussed yesterday, environment is visibly invisible. It is all pervasive, but it is not being documented. Historically, it has not been documented. If there is a major event, it is a catastrophe, that catastrophe has been documented, but geography, environment was never documented. It was taken for granted that it is there, and then historians or writers or poets were writing their history and whatever work they were doing. This primacy of environment is basically, as Richard Grove argues, basically is 17th, 18th century phenomena. But analysis school tried to cross this barrier and they examined history in terms of environment for the period for which this kind of documentation was not available. Let me cite few prominent works of analysis school That will make you understand why I am stressing so much on his contribution of analysis historians. Mark Bloch, a famous analysis historian, he wrote Feudal Society, and in Feudal Society he was examining primarily in what ways agrarian production has been defining the nature of feudal society. Till that date, feudal society was being examined in terms of political formation, in terms of economic conditions, in terms of economic exploitation. Mark Bloch took care of all these considerations, but he also suggested that the feudal society is construction of a particular kind of production relations where society is meeting requirements of geography and then using the available resources for its sustenance. In the process, production relations are being defined, and those production relations define the character of feudal society. As a student of historian, most of you must be aware that Indian history has been defined in terms of the ancient past as feudal society. In what ways that is a feudal society, Mark Bloch was trying to argue. He was trying to give lead for further examination of feudal societies of other parts of the globe. What I am trying to suggest is that examination of environment, examination of geographical factors enabled historians of other regions to question, though apparently they are similar in political formation, apparently they are similar in economic formation, but in terms of actual production processes, they were different. For example, the feudalism in Europe was usually, when transported to India, was termed as Indian feudalism. It was not being suggested feudalism in India, because the variety of feudalism which was visible or can be seen in India is not the same as it was visible in Western Europe. So, it was termed as Indian feudalism. Professor Harbans Mukhya, who used to teach in Jawaharlal Nehru University, he, in one of the classical essay, argued that though this is a formulation which has been proposed, but if we examine production processes, if we examine agrarian production and its process of production and its process of extraction, then we will understand that Indian society cannot be termed as feudal in any manner. Unlike feudal societies of Western Europe, where production process was managed by, influenced by, controlled by the feudal lords, in Indian society it was not the case. In Indian case, peasantry was free to cultivate whatever they wanted to cultivate. It was only a share of the produce in which feudal lords were interested. So, by examining agrarian processes, the character of Indian society in terms of feudal or not was questioned and modified. That is what the significance of environmental historians have been. Professor Mukhya never called himself as an environmental historian, but now we can say that he was examining, giving primacy to environmental factors and then suggesting that in what ways that different environment of Europe vis-a-vis India has generated a different kind of negotiation. That is why in India it cannot be termed as feudalism at all. The primary argument which was suggested by Professor Mukhya was that the seed yield ratio in classical Western Europe was simply 1:2.5. If you sow a seed, if you sow 1 kg of wheat, you will get 2.5 kg of wheat. Whereas in India, usually if you sow 1 kg of wheat, you will get 16 to 32 kg of wheat, and that too twice in a year. Unlike Europe, where you get only one crop in the beginning, in the 4th, 5th century, in India you were getting at least 2 crops, and in more fertile regions, more better placed in terms of water, you were getting 3 crops a year. With such high productivity, the production relations were different, which meant we must understand that environment was playing very crucial role when we examine, when we understand any particular society. Let me extend that in terms of another writing of analysis school, Emmanuel Leroy Ladurie. The classic book which he wrote is Times of Feast, Times of Famine, a history of climate since the year 1000, AD. He was writing history of climate not in terms of temperature, not in terms of precipitation, but in terms of overall climate. And then he is terming this phase as, at times there are times of feast, at times there are times of famine, and it is a recurring regular feature. If climate is favorable, then it is a time of feast. If it is a climate is unfavorable, then it is time of famine. Which means the famines, though they are natural factor, but how these famines were influencing the social formations were being examined by Laduri. The sources which he was using, that are excellent exposition how environmental historian needs to work. In classical Western Europe, the church used to collect taxes or tithe or the offerings from the peasantry. These offerings were recorded in church registers. So, the date and time and the amount of offering were kept in a record. These records were used by Laduri to examine climatic fluctuations. If climate has been good, if the weather has been as it should be, then at appropriate time the church will get their due. The church will get in due amount. But if there is any fluctuation, then the date of that will be later or earlier, and the amount will be proportionately reduced. So, by examining these records, Laduri was able to reconstruct history of climate since 1000. It is important for us simply because as a historian now we can say that environment as a factor was playing such a crucial role that at times society treated this as a feast, and at times society was forced to face the hardship of famine. So, these kind of examinations have been very important in analysis school. Let me extend that by examining another historian of analysis school. It is Fernand Braudel. The classic book which he wrote is Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II. He was writing history of an ocean, Mediterranean. He is not writing history of Philip II. It is a classic departure from histories which were being written till that time. He is suggesting that we must examine the geographical formation, how Mediterranean Sea has been playing an important role in shaping the history of areas surrounding it, be it Europe, be it part of Asia, be it part of Africa. All this is being influenced by one common factor, and that is Mediterranean. As a conventional historians, we were centered on history of kings, history of social formations, later on history of gender. Here, Braudel placed an inanimate object as center of his study, Mediterranean. We must examine how Mediterranean was influencing social formations in Italy, in Greece, in Levant area, Egypt, in the Northern America, Africa. The central features which is connecting all of them is basically Mediterranean. And he is not examining, please understand, he is not examining history of North Africa, either history of Egypt or history of Levant or history of Greece or history of Italy or history of Portugal, history of Spain. He is examining history of an ocean in particular time frame and then suggesting that it is viable to examine history in these terms as well. This is very significant, and this predates Industrial Revolution. I will be coming to that later on, but at the moment let me stress that it was not easy for Braudel to write this kind of history for a time for which we have limited records available. And then he was cutting across regions, he was cutting across different languages, because all these societies are speaking different languages, and he was using sources of all these areas to construct the history of an ocean. That is very significant. This contribution of analysis school has made all the historians across the globe realize the importance, the centrality, the significance of environment and environmental factors. If Mark Bloch was examining the land and the agrarian cycles, then Laduri was examining the climate and climatic fluctuations. Then Brodale is examining the oceans, how oceans have been defining the historical processes of societies in and around a Mediterranean Sea. These became very important writings for environmental historians later on, because they could understand that we can write history of a village, the history of Languedoc, Laduri. History of village can be written in terms of how village as a unit is constructing its own history, its production system, its negotiations, etc., etc. Which means the primacy of humans has been replaced by giving due significance to other factors which were playing, if not more than equally important role in the construction, in the creation of history as we understand today. Now, let me move forward to what I have been arguing yesterday. Before we discuss this, please remember we have to take care of analysis school and its writings. As we were discussing Richard Grove, it is basically the impact of colonialism which has been the focus of area of examination for environmental historians of India. But before I come to that and examine the very classic book by Ramchand Guha and Madhav Gadgil, This Future Land, let me give you two very important cautions, then we will proceed further. One is, unfortunately, because of the primacy of colonialism in environmental history, it was imagined, it was created, it was suggested that there was a glorious ancient and medieval past, a past where humans were living in harmony with nature. What do we mean by harmony? That was not being defined. This harmony was broken by colonialism is the other argument, is a assumption on which early historians of environmental history of India were working on. Why is it so? That I will later on examine. Grove has argued, and we must also understand that industrial revolution played very important role in modifying human nature interactions. While doing so, what was important is that they transformed the conventional methods of negotiations and they replaced with a new exploitative methods of negotiations. In the process, we must also understand that with the geographical discoveries, with the industrial revolution, the whole globe became one. Now, natural resources of one region can be exploited for the benefit of natural resources of for the benefit of economy of other areas. This global integration has, difficult to say fortunate or unfortunate, but these global connectivity has led to exploitation of natural resources of various parts of globe. Now, no part of globe is left untouched. The only exception till date is Antarctica, and I am not sure how long will that be able to sustain. The growing need for resources has been forcing exploitation of resources all across globe. I will examine this in a little bit more detail so that you will be able to understand why it is important to understand this, and then the difference and difficulties which are being faced by environmental historians who work on areas and time frame prior to this. Industrial revolution, as I was discussing yesterday, is basically replacement of biotic source of energy with the abiotic source of energy, and now machine started working 24 hours 7 days a week. In that process, in that situation, what was happening is that the natural resources were being drained from other regions. That is the phase when Europe was colonizing different parts of globe. They had already discovered New World. They were controlling South America as well as North America. Though by 1776, North America had declared its independence, and later on even the South America, the countries of South America declared independence. But the impact of industrial revolution and associated with colonialism was witnessed by both these continents. When we see decline of colonialism in those areas, we witness emergence of colonialism in other parts of globe, especially Asia. What was happening is that to feed the machines of Europe, natural resources of different regions were being extracted extensively. Natural resources were being exploited by humans since ancient past. But now, for the first time, what is happening that the resources of one region were being used for benefit of other region without any benefit occurring to the nature or the area of production itself. That is what colonialism is, that exploiting resources of one country for the benefit of mother country. While doing so, they were not careful enough to take care of concerns of environment, concerns of forest, concerns of climate, concerns of marginal sections of society. Their primary concern was maximization of land revenue, maximization of revenue, maximization of extraction of resources. In that sense, two other factors which were also very important and playing very important role in this process was population explosion accompanied by enhanced life expectancy and later on democratization of natural resources. Let me examine one by one, then you will be able to examine that. With the coming of modern science, with the coming of scientific revolution, 17th, 18th century, enlightenment in Europe, the mortality rate started declining. It was good for the humanity that mortality rate started declining. With the decline in mortality rate and with the greater availability of resources, both the things simultaneously, decline in mortality rate and availability of greater resources at the disposal of societies, what was happening that population was increasing. This enhancement in population was also accompanied simultaneously with the enhanced life expectancy, which means greater number of people were living on earth for greater number of years. You can understand these societies which were exploiting natural resources had limited population and they were living for a very restricted time frame. With the enhanced life expectancy and enhanced population, what is happening that on the same resources now the pressure is increasing, which means the conflict over natural resources is being multiplied. This multiplication is also influenced or affected by the process of democratization. Please remember, please understand, I am nowhere criticizing all these processes. I am simply trying to argue that because of these processes, impact on natural resources increased tremendously. When we say impact of industrial revolution, the impact of industrial revolution is not only in terms of greater stress on fossil fuel, but also in terms of greater population living for much longer and democratization of resources. Let me elaborate a bit on democratization of resources so that it is easy for you to understand. If I cite example from India, then perhaps things will become much more clear for you. In Indian society, you know, it's a caste ridden society, and in that caste ridden society, the benefits of environmental production was basically enjoyed by a minority of population, a minuscule minority. The large section of population was living on bare minimum, which means the exploitation was being done to cater the needs of very limited sections of population, and the last section of population was sustaining on very limited resources. By implication, what I am suggesting is that the pressure on natural resources was restricted. Simply because the less number of people had access to greater resources, the exploitation was limited. I am not criticizing democratization, please understand. I am simply suggesting that this democratization of resources also led to greater access for the masses, which means now you need to provide certain other amenities and if possible certain luxuries to the common man, which means the demand for natural resources is now being multiplied, which means there is a possibility you are forced to exploit natural resources to a greater extent. This natural exploitation, since it took place in a very short span of 200 to 250 years, the impact was clearly visible. This visible impact has been documented by environmental historians. That is why we have been trying to suggest that it is 17th century onward, greater documentation, and with the Industrial Revolution, greater exploitation of natural resources led to scenario where environmental historians have greater access to document changes caused by environment and changes caused to environment. But that does not mean that environmental historians are not working on area prior to this. We have been examining time frame of area of pre-industrial era as well. The details I will discuss sometime later, but let me briefly give you a couple of examples to make you understand how environmental historians of pre-industrial era have been examining history. 2-3 quick examples. Francis Zimmerman, he wrote classic book The Jungles and the Aroma of Meats, Ecological Themes in Hindu Medicine. What he did, by examining the medicines prescribed in the Ayurveda, he said that if Ayurveda is prescribing these kind of medicines based on these kind of natural ingredients, which means these natural ingredients must be present in that society, which means the society of that time was sustaining this vegetation and this kind of fauna. If these raw materials were prescribed by Ayurveda, which means these kind of raw materials were available in the society. By default, we can understand the climate of that time, the vegetation of that time and the fauna of that time. Using a very different treatise which was written for medical purposes, Zimmerman was trying to suggest that we can read the ecology of that time as understood by practitioners of Ayurveda. He is nowhere suggesting that this was the climate at that time. He is simply suggesting that if we examine this source, then this kind of image of climate of that period can be deciphered. The other books I have also cited, which you can get on this PowerPoint. Let me move to 2 different articles so that things will become much more clear to you. There is a Thomas Trotman wrote Elephants and the Mauryas, but the much more important at the moment for me is examining Devbhanu Singh's book, The End of a Trail, The Cheetah in India. Devbhanu Singh, he started examining the history of cheetah in India. By examining Mughal documents, pre-Mughal documents, paintings, sculptures, he was trying to locate presence of cheetah in historical times. And he could also understand that with the coming of colonialism, with the coming of greater pressure on natural resources, there was a tendency to wipe out the cheetahs. Unfortunately or fortunately, cheetah could never breed in captivity. Mughals captured them, Mughals were using them for hunt. From one side, Mughal emperor used to move, and from the other side, cheetah were left. These cheetahs used to drive the animals, wild animals, towards the emperor. So cheetahs were being used for hunting purposes. What Devbhanu Singh does is that tells us that in pre-medieval time, in pre-modern times, the kind of understanding of flora, fauna, jungle, animals, which was accessible to the common man, which was accessible to the ruling class, can be understood by examining history of cheetah. What I am suggesting is simply that please understand that environmental historians are working on flora, fauna, and since we are running short of time, let me give you last. We are also examining history of monsoons. We are also examining history of climatic fluctuations in the sustenance, decline or survival of societies. When we meet next, I will be elaborating on these themes individually in greater details.
Thank you so much, sir, for also summing it up so well for our students and also providing an exhaustive list of books and articles that they can consult for their study. And so, friends, sir has already talked about what he shall be discussing in the next lecture. So, please stay tuned in for that. And if you have any questions, those also you can send us and also watch this on YouTube. So, with this, we would like to take your leave. So, thank you so much for being present.
Do I have a minute?
Unfortunately, we don't.
Okay, right. Then we'll discuss when we meet next.
Right. We will continue with that. Thank you, sir, and thank you, friends, for watching.
Thanks a lot.
Have a great day.